In ancient myths across the world, the first chapters of history do not begin with humankind. They begin with silence, with darkness, with oceans without shores, with mountains that have not yet been named. And then, almost everywhere, they begin with beings who are not human at all. According to early traditions, our world once belonged to powers that moved through it as if it were unfinished clay. Their footsteps shaped valleys, their voices carried laws. Their conflicts became weather, their births became constellations. In these stories, humanity is not the origin of civilization, but the late arrival. A presence that enters after something older has already risen, ruled, and fallen. To modern ears, myth can sound like pure invention, yet myths are rarely random. They are the memory systems of cultures that did not write, or that wrote only after countless generations had already spoken their truths into the night. It is possible that what we call legend is not only imagination, but remembrance altered by time, carried through metaphor, and shaped into stories that could survive in the human voice. There is a reason so many ancient peoples begin by describing an age that feels fundamentally different from our own, a world ruled by gods, by giants, and by beings whose scale of life and power eclipses anything human. It is a world that seems older than history, and yet strangely familiar in its patterns, as if different cultures were hearing echoes of the same distant thunder. In the Greek imagination, the oldest rulers are not the bright Olympians of later poetry, but the Titans' primordial forces with vast strength and ancient authority. They are not merely large, they are foundational. They belong to the architecture of reality itself, closer to earth and sky than to the small dramas of human life. The Titans precede the age of mortals, and even precede the gods who later claim the throne. Their reign ends not in quiet retirement, but in warring upheaval so great it becomes a cosmic turning point. Far from Greece, in the early traditions of South Asia, we find a different landscape but a familiar shape. Here the cosmos includes devas and asuras, powerful beings often set in tension, sometimes described as rivals for sovereignty, sometimes as mirrors reflecting the struggle between order and chaos. The devas are associated with light, law, and the maintenance of cosmic balance. The asuras are complex, sometimes portrayed as proud challengers, sometimes as beings of immense capability whose conflict with the devas becomes a drama of ambition, power, and fate. In these narratives, the world is not governed by humans. It is governed by entities whose lifespans stretch beyond ordinary counting, whose battles reshape the world's moral and physical order. In Mesopotamia, among the oldest written myths we possess, the Anunnaki appear divine figures linked to authority, judgment, and the distribution of roles in the cosmos. They are not portrayed as distant abstractions. They act, decree, and structure reality. Some later interpretations, both ancient and modern, have wrapped them in speculation, but their core place in early tradition is clear. They belong to a time when the world's governance was divine, when kingship itself was imagined as descending from above, and when human society was framed as living beneath a higher administration of existence. In the biblical tradition and related writings, we encounter the Nephilim and other towering figures whose memory has sparked centuries of debate. The texts are brief, often ambiguous, yet powerful enough to leave a lasting imprint, an echo of giants, of mighty ones, of a world where the boundary between the human and the non-human felt unstable. Some later traditions expand these hints into full narratives of primordial beings and a corrupted ancient age. Whether one treats these accounts as theological metaphor or cultural memory, they participate in the same global pattern, a time before ordinary humanity, crowded with larger presences. Titans, Asuras, Anunnaki, Devas, Nephilim, different names, different moral colorings, different mythic landscapes. Yet the shared traits are striking. Again and again, these beings are described as ancient beyond human measure. They possess longevity, authority, and power. They are bound to earth not as guests, but as rulers. And in many stories, they precede humans, supervise humans, or stand above humans as a class stands above another. How did cultures separated by oceans and millennia produce such similar portraits of a primordial age? The simplest answer is that human minds share certain instincts. We look backward and imagine beginnings as larger than life. We project authority into the heavens. We create divine genealogies to explain why the world feels both ordered and dangerous. Some scholars suggest that these similarities are the result of psychological archetypes, shared patterns that arise in human storytelling across time, like recurring dreams. And yet, the parallels can feel too consistent to dismiss as coincidence alone. In ancient myths across the world, the early world is not a quiet garden. It is a contested territory. It is governed by non-human powers. It contains races of beings, older orders, and cosmic hierarchies. It ends in catastrophe, and only then do humans become central. Consider, too, the way these stories portray human origins. In some traditions, humans are shaped deliberately, formed from earth or clay, animated by breath or divine essence. The Sumerian and Akkadian myths describe humans created to relieve the gods of labor, to carry burdens that divine beings no longer wish to bear. In Greek myth, the ages of humanity descend from a brighter past into heavier, harsher times, as if the world's original purity has been lost. In some South Asian accounts, cycles of ages rise and fall, with humans appearing within vast rhythms that dwarf individual civilizations. The implication is not simply that gods exist, but that humanity is a later development and adaptation, a consequence, sometimes even an afterthought. This leads to one of the most unsettling themes in early tradition, the image of a world ruled by non-humans. Not metaphorically, but socially and politically, as if Earth itself once belonged to a different order. Mountains were thrones, rivers were boundaries set by divine decree. Storms were not random, they were weapons or moods. Law did not originate in human councils, it arrived from beings older than the first cities. In such stories, humans often live in a subordinate role. They serve, they worship, they fear, they bargain. Even when humans are heroic, they are rarely sovereign. Their greatness is defined by proximity to the divine, by being favored, cursed, instructed, or tested. The world feels like a realm administered by powers that do not share human limitations. But gods are not the only inhabitants of this primordial earth. Alongside them move beasts and monstrous creatures that blur categories, that combine forms, that embody the wildness of an untamed world. Serpents coil through the earliest chapters of myth with almost hypnotic persistence. In Mesopotamia, a dragon of chaos threatens the order of the gods. In later traditions, serpents guard treasures, encircle oceans, or represent the raw force that must be subdued for civilization to exist. In Norse myth, a world serpent coils so vast it borders the seas. In South Asian tradition, gods appear as powerful serpent beings, sometimes protective, sometimes dangerous, living in hidden realms beneath rivers and earth. Giants also appear again and again, massive beings tied to mountains, storms, and older laws. Some are enemies of gods, some are ancestors. Some are simply reminders that the world once held life on a scale that humans can barely imagine. Hybrid beings, half human, half animal, stand as guardians of thresholds, the Sphinx, the Lamassu, the Centaur. These creatures occupy the boundary between nature and culture, between instinct and reason, between the world as it is and the world as it was. It is tempting to treat these beings as mere fantasy, yet monsters rarely exist only to frighten. They often symbolize a world that resists domestication, a world where survival is not guaranteed. A world where civilization is fragile, and where order is constantly threatened by forces that do not negotiate. Some scholars suggest that these creatures represent human encounters with the unknown, dangerous landscapes, predators, storms, disease, famine. Others suggest they serve a deeper function, embodying the chaos that must be named before it can be faced. And there is another possibility, quieter and more controversial, that monstrous imagery sometimes preserves distorted impressions of real things. Fossils unearthed by ancient peoples, megafauna remembered through oral tradition. catastrophic events interpreted through mythic language. The past filtered through human meaning, returning not as data but as story. When we place these traditions side by side, three interpretations emerge, each compelling in its own way. First, myth as metaphor. Under this view, the age of gods and beasts is a symbolic map of human experience. Titans and Asuras are not literal races, but expressions of power, ambition, and the struggle between structure and disruption. Floods represent cleansing, renewal, and the limits of human pride. Monsters represent fear and the wildness inside the human mind. This interpretation has strength because it explains why myths remain emotionally true even when they are not historically precise. Second, myth as psychological archetype. Here, the similarities across cultures arise because the human mind, in all places, tends to imagine origins in certain patterns, a sacred beginning, a fall, a conflict among higher powers, a catastrophe, and a new order. In this view, the world before humans is not a remembered epic, but a shared inner landscape. It is the mind's way of talking about beginnings, about how consciousness itself emerges from chaos. Third, myth as historical echo. This is the most tantalizing and the most difficult to prove. Under this view, myths preserve fragments misremembered, poetically reshaped of real events or long processes, shifts in climate, migrations, collapses of older societies, disasters that left deep scars, encounters between peoples that later became gods and giants in the retelling. It is possible that the ancient world contained knowledge that survived only in ritual and narrative, carried forward like embers in ash. Not precise enough to be called history, yet persistent enough to haunt the imagination of entire civilizations. None of these interpretations needs to exclude the others. Myth can be metaphor and memory at the same time. A flood story can encode trauma, geography, theology, and psychology all at once. A giant can be a symbol of overwhelming nature and also an echo of an older people remembered as larger than life. The question is not which interpretation wins, but what human beings were trying to preserve. Because again and again, these stories insist on an ending and end to the age of gods. In Greek tradition, the Titanomachy is a war not merely between families of gods, but between eras. The cosmos changes rulers, order is redefined. The old powers are cast down, imprisoned, or pushed to the margins of the world. In South Asian tradition, conflicts between Devas and Asuras appear across texts and cycles, suggesting a universe where balance is maintained through struggle and where the world periodically resets its hierarchy. In Mesopotamian tradition, divine councils decide fates, and human kings rise under the shadow of heavenly decree. In biblical and Near Eastern flood traditions, waters erase an older world, and a new covenant begins. Floods, in particular, appear with remarkable frequency. According to early traditions, the world is sometimes washed clean by divine judgment, by imbalance, by cosmic necessity. Rivers swell beyond their boundaries. Seas consume land, mountains become islands. Survivors cling to wood, to high ground, to whatever can float. When the waters retreat, the world feels altered. The old age is gone. Something has ended and something else has begun. Some scholars suggest that flood myths may preserve memories of real inundations at the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose and coastlines vanished. Others caution that floods are also universal symbols. They represent chaos returning, the dissolving of boundaries, the terrifying power of nature. It is possible that both are true. A real disaster can become a sacred narrative precisely because it already carries symbolic weight. Wars among gods also function as endings. They mark the collapse of an earlier order. They explain why the world is not ruled openly by divine beings anymore. They create distance between humanity and the powers that once walked close to Earth. After the war, after the flood, after the catastrophe, the world becomes more human. Not necessarily safer, but more familiar. The gods retreat to mountains, heavens, or hidden realms. The giants vanish into caves and far islands. Monsters become rarer, confined to legends or to the edges of maps where certainty breaks down. And yet, the stories survive. That is perhaps the most important fact of all. Oral traditions are fragile in detail, but strong in meaning. Names change, places shift, timelines blur. But what a culture considers vital tends to persist. Warnings about pride, reminders of vulnerability, reverence for forces beyond control, and memories of upheaval. Myths endure because they encode something important about how the world feels, about how the world can change, and about how small human beings are in the face of time. In ancient myths across the world before humans is not a golden paradise. It is a realm of immense forces, sometimes wise, sometimes violent, sometimes indifferent. It is a time when the boundaries of life were less settled, when gods and beasts shared the stage, when Earth itself seemed closer to the raw materials of creation. Whether that age existed as a literal epoch is not the only question. The deeper question is why humanity keeps returning to it. Why so many civilizations, independent in language and landscape, imagined that before our time there was another, ruled by beings larger than we are. Perhaps it is because humans sense instinctively that we arrived late in the story. We look at mountains and oceans and feel that they have witnessed ages we will never know. We uncover ruins beneath ruins. We find bones of creatures that no longer exist. We live on a planet whose past is vast and whose changes can be sudden. It is possible that these myths do not tell us exactly what happened, but they may be pointing toward the fact that something happened, that the world has known upheavals so profound they became sacred, that human history may sit atop older layers of memory, some preserved in stone, some preserved in story, and so we end where we began, at the threshold between the known and the imagined. In the quiet space before written history, myths offer us a mirror. In that mirror we see gods and giants, serpents and hybrid beasts, wars in the heavens and floods across the land. We see a world ruled by non-humans, and then a turning, a retreat, a beginning of the human age. If these stories are only metaphor, they still reveal something true about the human mind and its need to understand origins. If they are archetypes, they show how deeply certain patterns are etched into our imagination. And if they are echoes of lost history, then they may be the faintest surviving footprints of a forgotten world. In the end, the age of gods and beasts remains just beyond our reach, like a coastline seen through mist. We can map its outlines, compare its shapes, and listen for the repeated motifs that return from culture to culture like waves. We can weigh symbolism against memory and myth against archaeology without forcing certainty where none can exist. And perhaps that is what these ancient traditions were meant to give us, not a final answer, but a lasting question. Whether the world before humans was only imagined or quietly remembered, the stories insist that our present is not the whole of reality. They invite us to look deeper into time, to accept mystery without surrendering thought, and to recognize that even when facts fade, meaning can endure, carried forward, generation after generation, as the echo of a forgotten world.